Hello, welcome to the fifth episode of the Henry George Daily Devotional. We left off in the middle of Book 1, Chapter 1. Book 1 is about wages and something. And I had gotten confused over this bit where it was using some odd numbers. If you're watching, you can see that it says 6,100,000 and 680,000. And I have figured out that the 6 is not a 6. It is a dollar symbol. So the sentence should read, for instance, $100,000 devoted in an old country to manufactures. $80,000 would probably be expended for buildings, machinery, and the purchase of materials, leaving but $20,000 to be paid out in wages. See, the math adds up. 20,000 plus 80,000 is 100,000. The 6 was a dollar symbol. So that I figured that out immediately after I ended the stream, the recording yesterday. But I'm going to continue from there. So that was the breakdown in an old country, and then he says, whereas in a new country of $30,000 devoted to agriculture, etc., not more than $5,000 would be required for tools, leaving $25,000 to be distributed in wages. In this way, it is explained that the wage fund may be comparatively large, where capital is comparatively scarce, and high wages and high interest accompany each other. I feel like he said that a little unclearly. In the country example, he didn't start with the total budget. The total budget would be $35,000 in the country. $25K went to labor, only $5K to tools. In the city, your total budget was $100,000, but $80,000 went to the buildings, and only $20K went to the workers. Okay, we'll continue. In what follows, I think I shall be able to show that this explanation is based upon a total misapprehension of the relations of labor to capital, a fundamental error as to the fund from which wages are drawn. But at present it is necessary only to point out that the connection in the fluctuation of wages and interest in the same countries and in the same branches of industry cannot thus be explained. In those alternations known as, quote, good times and, quote, hard times, a brisk demand for labor and good wages is always accompanied by a brisk demand for capital and stiff rates of interest, while when laborers cannot find employment and wages droop, there is always an accumulation of capital-seeking investment at low rates. We have a footnote. It reads, times of commercial panic are marked by high rates of discount, but this is evidently not a high rate of interest, properly so called, but a rate of insurance against risk. That seems like a typo. That it should read, but of a rate. I don't know. But a rate of insurance against risk. Looks like my next job after reading the book will be to do a new translation of Georgism, of Progress and Poverty, the new American Standard version of Progress and Poverty. The present depression has been no less marked by want of employment and distress among the working classes than by the accumulation of unemployed capital in all the great centers, and by nominal rates of interest on undoubted security. Thus, under conditions which admit of no explanation consistent with the current theory, do we find high interest coinciding with high wages, and low interest with low wages. Capital seemingly scarce when labor is scarce, and abundant when labor is abundant. Another quick remark is, I don't recall finding these typos when I had my hard copy. I've given away a few copies of Progress and Poverty, and the last one I had I gave away 2 months ago, and I do not have a hard copy at the moment. But I don't remember noticing any typos, but maybe I did. I don't know. All these well-known facts, which coincide with each other, point to a relation between wages and interest, but it is to a relation of conjunction, not of opposition, Evidently, they are utterly inconsistent with the theory that wages are determined by the ratio between labor and capital or any part of capital. How then, it will be asked, could such a theory arise? How is it that it has been accepted by a succession of economists from the time of Adam Smith to the present day? If we examine the reasoning by which in current treatises this theory of wages is supported, we see at once that it is not an induction from observed facts, but a deduction from a previously assumed theory, viz., that wages are drawn from capital. It being assumed that capital is the source of wages, it necessarily follows that the gross amount of wages must be limited by the amount of capital devoted to the employment of labor, and hence that the amount individual laborers can receive must be determined by the ratio between their number and the amount of capital existing for their recompense. Footnote. For instance, McCulloch, in note 6 to quote Wealth of Nations, says, that portion of the capital or wealth of a country which the employers of labor intend to or are willing to pay out in the purchase of labor may be much larger at one time than another. But whatever may be its absolute magnitude, it obviously forms the only source from which any portion of the wages of labor can be derived. No other fund is in existence from which the laborer as such can draw a single shilling, and hence it follows that the average rate of wages or the share of the national capital appropriated to the employment of labor falling at an average to each laborer must entirely depend on its amount as compared with the number of those amongst whom it has to be divided. End quote. That was what McCulloch said. Similar citations might be made from all the standard economists. So, recalling a comment in the chat from a few days ago about George's belabored rhetoric and my argument that it was somewhat endemic to the times, I think this footnote is an example of someone else writing long sentences. This has nothing to do with the truth of Georgism. Just a comment. We continue. This reasoning is valid, but the conclusion, as we have seen, does not correspond with the facts. The fault, therefore, must be in the premises. Let us see. That's right. For a sound argument, the premises has to be true, and then the reasoning has to be true, valid, and sound. I don't remember. I am aware that the theorem that wages are drawn from capital is one of the most fundamental and apparently best settled of current political economy, and that it has been accepted as axiomatic by all the great thinkers who have devoted their powers to the elucidation of the science. Nevertheless, I think it can be demonstrated to be a fundamental error, the fruitful parent of a long series of errors, which vitiate most important practical conclusions. This demonstration I am about to attempt. It is necessary that it should be clear and conclusive, for a doctrine upon which so much important reasoning is based, which is supposed by such a weight of authority, which is so plausible in itself and is so liable to recur in different forms, cannot be safely brushed aside in a paragraph. The proposition I shall endeavor to prove is, and this is all in italics, that wages, instead of being drawn from capital, are in reality drawn from the product of the labor for which they are paid. Footnote. We are speaking of labor expended in production, to which it is best, for the sake of simplicity, to confine the inquiry. Any question which may arise in the reader's mind as to wages for unproductive services had best therefore be deferred. All right, we're not talking about unproductive services. Good to know. We continue. Now, inasmuch as the current theory that wages are drawn from capital also holds that capital is reimbursed from production, this at first glance may seem a distinction without a difference, a mere change in terminology, to discuss which would be but to add to those unprofitable disputes that render so much that has been written upon economic subjects as barren and worthless as the controversies of the various learned societies about the true reading of the inscription on the stone that Mr. Pickwick found. But That it is much more than a formal distinction will be apparent when it is considered that upon the difference between the two propositions are built up all the current theories as to the relations of capital and labor. That from it are deduced doctrines that themselves regarded as axiomatic, bound, direct, and that themselves are regarded as axiomatic, bound, direct, and govern the ablest minds in the discussions of the most momentous questions. Apparently, this was just a really popular theory. For upon the assumption that wages are drawn directly from capital and not from the product of the labor is based not only the doctrine that wages depend upon the ratio between capital and labor, but the doctrine that industry is limited by capital, that capital must be accumulated before labor is employed, and labor cannot be employed except as capital is accumulated. The doctrine that every increase of capital gives or is capable of giving additional employment to industry. The doctrine that the conversion of circulating capital into fixed capital lessens the fund applicable to the maintenance of labor. The doctrine that more laborers can be employed at low wages than at high wages. The doctrine that capital applied to agriculture will maintain more laborers than if applied to manufactures. The doctrine that profits are high or low as wages are low or high, inverse, that they depend upon the cost of the subsistence of laborers, together with such paradoxes as that a demand for commodities is not a demand for labor, or that commodities may be increased in cost by a reduction in wages or diminished in cost by an increase in wages. All right, we will stop there, and we will eagerly await George setting us straight on why the wages are not determined by how much money the employer has at the start of labor. See you next time, my little Georgists.